So we're going to talk about what are the impacts of our habits and choices. And to do that, I want to introduce Kathy Middlecamp and turn it over to you. Let's give Kathy Middlecamp a warm welcome. She has a talking banana.
I brought my talk. Thank you very much, Derren. We are ready to rock up here. There he is, yes. I'll get to the banana in a minute, but what I will do for you is to introduce the panel first, and then our keynote speaker, and then we're just ready to play. What we are looking forward to is the time to interact with the audience. So on the table here we have a full professor, a postdoctoral fellow, and a graduate student in environment and resource. Now which one is which? Tom Bryan, graduate student. Lydia Cepeda, professor, consumer science. Consumer resources or consumer science? Consumer science. Consumer science, got it right. And Maggie Graboff, postdoctoral fellow in the Global Health Institute. They're the ones who are sweating because they have the rapid fire talks, the pachachka or the pechakucha, chit-chat in Japanese. But first, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Mike Berners-Lee, and kindly they provided props today for the author of How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything. That's not his that's not his only book. It's his first book, but he also is the Weston Roundtable speaker later this afternoon, 4:30, right here, on The Burning Question, which is his second book. But I'm just going to get out of your way, let you come up here and do this, and we're really glad you came over from the UK. Thank you so much, Mike. You've got to be recorded up there, yes.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for asking me to speak. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk just quickly from my first book, How Bad Are Bananas? Carbon Footprint of Everything. That's what the British version of it looks like. Your version looks a bit different. That's interesting. This isn't. Okay. Thanks, next slide, yeah. Okay, so it's all about, here we are in this world where we realize climate change is going on, and we all have these massive impacts. And just click again. In fact, I'll come up and click. It's okay. Okay. So we're quite good at managing direct impacts that we can see in front of our own eyes. So nobody in this room is going to hit anybody else in this room because we kind of understand that kind of impact. And when it comes to kind of energy use, if we can see it coming out of a chimney, we get some kind of understanding that that's, there's an impact behind that, and we know that when we see the exhaust pipe of a car, we understand that there are some emissions going on. But that person there has got probably most of the time no real idea of what the impacts are that lie behind all that shopping she's just done. Because those impacts have taken place all over the world in a very diffuse kind of way, and we have very little information usually about what those impacts are. But here we are in global society, and just about everything that we do all of the time triggers impacts all over the place. And if we're going to act responsibly, then we better start trying to understand them a bit. So that's what all the book was about. And it's really trying to map out carbon footprints, by which I mean all the embodied carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalent, other greenhouse gases as well, that lie behind the creation of any goods or anything that we buy or anything that we do. And just to be clear, the supply chains that lie behind the manufacture of something are always hideously complex. And trying to map out the carbon numbers on them is, it's a real black art, no matter how much kind of academic rigor you bring to it. We're not talking about precisely known numbers. It's a bit like the Mappa Mundi there. We're kind of early map makers and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But the good news is that most of the time having just a rough map of it is good enough. We need to have a good enough understanding of the impacts of things that we can make vaguely sensible decisions about what things matter most and what things only matter a little bit. So both my books really are about perspective, and certainly How About a Banana is about trying to get perspective on things. So, because we need to build up this kind of impact, instinctive understanding about our carbon impact in the same way that we have one about money. So most people here would, you would probably, if you wanted to go and buy, if you felt like a cup of coffee and you're in town, you probably wouldn't have to think too hard before you went and bought it, but you wouldn't spontaneously just buy a house on the same kind of whim, because you understand that there's a few different numbers of zeros in the, in the price tags of the two. And, if you really felt like a bottle of champagne, well, okay, you know that that's somewhere in between the two of those. You might think about it a bit more carefully. So you have this kind of rough rough money instinct already built up, but we don't have that for carbon. So a few footprints to try and sort of, just very quickly, to try and get the idea of these relative magnitudes lined up. So there's humankind's carbon footprint, roughly speaking. All these numbers are going to be rough numbers. So it's about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And that's all the greenhouse gases rolled into one, but most of that is carbon dioxide. And if you're a typical UK person, that means it's about 15 tons a year. I'm afraid the bad news is if you're a typical American person, it's more like around 20 tons per year. That's not because you're bad people, it's mainly because you're a bit richer than we are. And if we were as rich as you, we'd be just as bad as you. That's kind of the way the world works at the moment. So this guy isn't, I don't know, do you get the royal family on TV in the States? Probably not, no, okay. So he's a sitcom, and he spends all his time watching TV, and actually he has quite a low carbon footprint because he never gets on an aeroplane and he's not into high fashion, and he has a kind of surprisingly inadvertent low carbon lifestyle. But if he was a typical person, I'll just show you what his footprint would look like. Now this is based on UK stuff, but it's not, actually, is this going to work? Yeah. It's not that dissimilar for an American person. So this much of his footprint would be his household fuel, maybe his gas bill. This much would be his vehicle fuel. This much would be his household electricity. This much would be personal flights, and of course it depends entirely on what kind of lifestyle he has. That could be massively higher. If he's flying a lot, if he never flies, it would vanish. This would be his other travel. This would be the car itself. So that's the embodied carbon in the manufacture of the car and its maintenance through its lifetime. So if you want to look at the carbon footprint of his driving, it's that one plus that one. We've been hearing about food and drink a little bit, and that is the carbon footprint of the food and drink just bought from the shops, up to the point of the checkout. It doesn't include anything from hotels and restaurants and stuff. This is hotels, pubs, pubs and catering and stuff like that. And so that's a whole load of food embodied in that. This is electrical goods, and that's growing all the time. This slide's actually a little bit out of date. That sliver now would be a little bit larger. We've been hearing about clothes and stuff. It's been great to be hearing about sort of what lies behind our clothes. So that's contained in here. Other bought goods and services. Almost everything you spend money on has got some kind of carbon footprint in it. Water and sewage, healthcare, education, a lot of that goes on here, and then this is all kind of government services, and then construction. So there's a lot more to that pie than just the energy bits that we usually hear about more than anything else. Am I doing on time? Okay, on time. Okay, so a few more carbon footprints. So here's unusually for me, I've actually flown halfway across the world for a few days. I usually do try and be frugal with my flying, I promise you. But so 15 tons is an average UK person for a year. If you go to Hong Kong once and back, that's about a third of it gone in one flight. And if you do it 3 times, that doesn't leave you anything much left for eating or having anything to wear or staying warm or anything like that. And if you fly first class and take up more of the plane, then you've nearly burned up your allowance in one hit. Okay, so that's flying. And this is another carbon footprint. So this is drying your hands. And I'm not going to go into the detail of this. We're talking about a few grams here. And depending on the exact technique you have for using different hand towels and exactly how long you keep it under the hand dryer and what kind of hand dryer you use, the pros and cons of the two could vary. But the reason I show these two slides is because somebody asked me once, Mike, how should I dry my hands when I use the bathroom? And the same person flies across the Atlantic several times a month. And it's like, you're asking the wrong question. We have a comedian in the UK who talks a lot about Derren Brown. He talks about misdirection of attention. It's one of his classic techniques. If you can get somebody focused on something that doesn't matter, then you can get away with anything you like if their attention's on the wrong stuff. And it's really important on this whole sustainability agenda that we get really good at working out which are the things that are small and which are the things that are big, and picking the big battles. And it's tempting not to. It's not that we shouldn't do the small stuff, but when we do the small stuff, we should understand that we're doing the small stuff, and it doesn't in any way kind of mitigate our need to deal with the big stuff as well. So the small stuff is good as long as it's a pathway to getting into the big stuff, but if it's a means by which we kind of let ourselves off the hook and say, that's fine, I'm a good person because I dry my hands the right way, and then get off and fly all over the place, then it could even be bad. So we need to keep it in perspective. So here's cars. These are all mainly British cars, but I've already talked about the embodied carbon in a car itself is actually a big part of the driving. And obviously that's kind of spread out over the lifetime of the car, so it's not per year. But small cars are a good thing compared to big cars. I just put this up because I'm just trying to do a bit of a smattering from the 100 or so things in the book. So just to give an idea of the invisibility of our impact half the time. So data centers the carbon footprint of data centers is flying through the roof. This slide is slightly dated now, but data centers are something like 1% of the world's carbon footprint now, or heading that way, which is about as big as paper ever used to be. So that's amazing, isn't it? We've got millions of times more efficient at storing information than we were maybe 50 years ago. And the carbon footprint of our information storage hasn't gone down. It's gone up because we're storing millions of times more information now. And also, we're doing both ways. We're doing the paper and we're doing the digital way. So we're not doing one to replace the other. We kind of tend to do both. And if we're not very careful, the whole of the efficiency agenda works that way. If you think about it, our lighting is 500 times more efficient than it was 150 years ago. The way we travel is more efficient. Everything's more efficient. And yet our impacts are going up. And so we need to just take from that the message that efficiency is good, but efficiency on its own doesn't get us there. We need to reduce our consumption as well. Okay, a tour of things. Food has come up a few times today. So this is a burger. All these numbers just rough. Average about 2.5 kilograms, but about 4.5 kilograms for a beef burger, 4-ounce beef burger, and just about 1 kilogram for a veggie burger. And there's no getting around it. That's because animals do inefficient things like walking around and keeping warm, so it makes a high meat diet less efficient. And also, in the case of beef, it's because cows burp up a lot of methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So I do a lot of work with a supermarket chain in the UK called Booths, and Asparagus became a real kind of fighting ground for over climate change. So in the UK, at least, I suspect it's a similar story for you guys. When asparagus is in season, it's a great low carbon food. The minute it goes out of season, we air freight it all from Peru, which is right on the other side of the world from us. And I'd be surprised if I would have thought it's probably a slightly different, the way you do your foods is probably slightly different, but I would have thought it's a very similar kind of story. The exact foods might change slightly. So the message there clearly is to wait till your asparagus is in season, and then when it's out of season again, just hold off and spend your time building up your appetite for your next in-season asparagus. I'm told the stuff from Peru doesn't even taste very nice anyway by the best chefs I know. Bottled water, I just put this one up because, it's an example of one of those, such a simple and needless thing, isn't it? There's a pint of tap water coming in at almost zero, and yet, however you do your bottled water, it's many, many times many, many times more impact than that. And you know what? The bottled water doesn't even, people say, some people try and tell me it tastes better or something, but that's not really true, is it? Is it true? Someone's going to... Thank you. Usually I get somebody loudly shouting, yeah, it is! Okay. A red rose. So this was one of the sort of surprising things in bananas. The nice thing about flowers is it's all the reason we buy flowers for people. It's all about the emotional appeal of the flowers. And if you buy a Valentine's Day rose for somebody in the UK, it's either been hothoused or it's been air freighted from Kenya or something like that. And either way round, it's a complete disaster environmentally. If it's in season and grown in your own garden, then it's down to zero. But quite a few people I've talked to over the years have said, they just don't want out-of-season flowers anymore because they understand now that that is an environmental disaster. And so when they look at them in their home, actually all that emotional appeal that they used to have has vanished now. They want something else. They want something in season, or they'd rather not have flowers. And I do know one or two people who've bought their partners a bunch of bananas on Valentine's Day. If you can try that, it's my tip for you. But it's an example of how once we become aware of something, what we want changes a bit. Once we've got that awareness and we've stopped to think. So food's come up a little bit. So this is rice, which I want to put up because it's not a high carbon food, it's not a bad food to have, but it's a real could do better food. So it's one of the world's top food sources. It produces something like 20% of the world's calories in exchange for something like 3.5% of the world's carbon footprint. And it could be loads better. If we just were smarter, if around the world we're just smarter with how we used fertilizer and were smarter with when we flooded paddy fields, and in particular not flooding paddy fields anything like as much, we could cut that carbon footprint right down. And you know what? The farmers would most of the time be better off as well. They'd be spending less money on fertilizer. The rivers wouldn't be turning green. So there's some real kind of simple wins. We know how to do that. 1 billion tons is about 2% of the world's carbon footprint. A carrier bag. Carrier bags sort of in landfill are nasty for all kinds of reasons, floating around the ocean. But in terms of their carbon footprint, they're something like 1/500th of what you might carry home from the supermarket. So I'm not saying forget about your plastic bags, but I am saying to a supermarket chain, sorting out your plastic bags doesn't constitute a full response to sustainability. How am I doing on time?
Just time to end, yeah.
Have I got 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, great. Okay, so a quick overview of the world's food system. So we grow, sorry the writing's a little bit small, I'll tell you what it says. So we grow about 6,000 calories a day per person around the world. That's about 3 times what we need. Isn't that a fantastic good news story? 3 times what we need. Let's have a look at where it goes. It's about 500 of it goes to biofuels, which isn't bad. It's good. We need biofuels if we're going to leave the fossil fuel in the ground. And about 900 just gets left in the ground. The supermarket doesn't want it anymore. They don't bother harvesting it. That's just an incredible waste that's got to stop. But that still leaves about 4,600 going off to edible crop harvest. So let's see what happens to that. Well, about 600 of it, in red there, goes to post-harvest waste. That's mainly in developing countries. It just rots in the ground. It just rots, but not in the ground. It's harvested, but then it rots. And sometimes that's just for lack of a plastic container to put it in. So that's, at face value, that's really solvable. And about 1,700 gets fed to animals, those inefficient animals I've mentioned. And they do inefficient things like walking around and keeping warm and stuff. And they also eat a lot of grass, some of which could be cropland. But we get about 500 back in terms of food into to people in terms of meat and dairy, which would leave us 2,000, which would leave us plenty. But then in developed countries like ours, about 800 goes to waste. That just gets left on the plate, or it rots in the fridge, or we don't feel like it, so we let it go off, or whatever. And that's something we've been hearing about waste today. It's really good we've been hearing about that, because we've got to do something about that. There's still just about enough, and if we shared it around perfectly, then we'd be fine. But of course we don't, so some people have to go hungry. So that food system there is just a very rough sketch of it, but it's a real land of opportunity. We can have if we sort it out, everyone can have enough, even with a growing population, even with some land getting less fertile because of climate change, and even with growing the amount of biofuels. so that we can still do things like some flying when we're keeping the carbon in the ground. If we don't sort it out, then either it's going to be a disaster one way or another. Either people are going to go hungry, and or we're not going to be able to fly at all, and or we'll keep ripping fuel out of the ground. Okay, I'm out of time, so I'm going to just going to stop. Thank you for listening.